The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance. It is the illusion of knowledge. Daniel J. Boorstin. In a world that never seems to stop talking, we've come to equate volume with validity. We see it everywhere, from the break room, across social media, as well as legacy media. And we're instinctively drawn to the people making the most noise. We can mistake their certainty for validation and their loudness for their credentials. Because a dominant voice is like a psychological sedative. It tells us that that person is in control. And for a moment, that feeling is enough to make us stop asking questions. But if you pull back the curtain, you'll see that true expertise is bolstered with the humility of knowing how much can actually go wrong. They're more calculated. And they're often quiet because they're too busy focusing on the complete picture to perform for an audience. Meanwhile, those who understand the least are often the most emboldened by their own ignorance. They speak with a level of confidence simply because they don't know enough to be quiet. And what compounds this is society doesn't always reward the quiet experts. More often, we give attention to the bold amateur because they provide the performance that draws likes and shares. We've come to value the speed of the response over the accuracy of the answer. And we're drawn to the noise because we're too distracted to demand substance. So it's time to stop being a consumer of the loudest voices and start being an auditor of actual results. And we tend to assume that if someone's willing to speak with conviction, they must have the knowledge and experience to back it up. We're wired to see confidence as the validation for ability. But far too often, the people who come off as the most certain are the least qualified for the complexity of the situation. And it's not that they're necessarily lying to you, as much as they haven't done enough of the work to realize how much they don't really know. True competence always usually carries a bit of hesitation and respect for the value of the work and gathering the complete picture, as opposed to simply the angle that fits their narrative. When you let someone's persona or their posture dictate and impact your direction, it's the lazy way to evaluate ownership and competence. But if we're being honest, we use their confidence as a shield so we don't have to do the heavy lifting. We don't have to do the thinking for ourselves. We let them be the expert because it's a lighter load for us to carry. So it's on you to start looking past the delivery. The weight of the outcome lands on the person who accepts the noise as truth. And once you realize that, volume doesn't equal validity. You'll start to hear the gaps in the presentation. But there's a difference between someone who has a lot to say and someone who has something worth hearing. And we've become addicted to the fast twitch response. Whoever can fill the silence the quickest usually wins our attention. So if you start paying attention to the signal to noise ratio, you'll see that as the volume and the frequency of someone's talking go up, the quality of their information usually goes down. It's their survival tactic because they need us for the clicks and the watch time. Whereas real expertise is dense. And for the ones who are quiet, it's often because they're busy processing the variables that the loud person doesn't even realize exists. When you're talking to someone who actually knows what they're talking about, they use words like generally or in this specific case. But that doesn't sound as exciting as making statements of certainty. The person who is about being controversial and making a spectacle of what they're saying often is simply a megaphone for their own limitations. But it takes discipline to stop being captivated by how much someone talks and start being interested in how much they actually know. We've become so used to the constant hum of opinions that we've lost our ear for the sound of actual experience. You've got to ask yourself, am I listening to this person because they're providing a solution? Or am I just listening because they're making the noise I want to hear? However, The solution isn't necessarily needing more information. You just need better information. But that rarely comes from the person who doesn't stop talking long enough to think. So then it's worth asking yourself, what draws you to these loud voices in the first place? Why do you walk into their trap? It might be because when you've identified a problem or an issue, which you've most likely got an emotional connection to, that frustration creates a large amount of stress, which is uncomfortable and exhausting. And when someone steps into that chaos with a loud voice and what appears to be competence, they provide a form of grounding that's actually referred to as an anxiety anchor. And even if the totality of the context of what they're saying is wrong, the boldness of their certainty gives you something to connect with. They give you that feeling of continuity and validation. But that's the danger of a false anchor. It gives you a sense of security instead of honestly evaluating the tension. It's easier to find alliance with a person who's saying what matches what we're thinking. But personal accountability means you have to have the crucial conversation with the voice in your head. You have to be okay with the tension of not knowing everything yet, rather than jumping on a dead-end train just because the conductor has a big mouth. And there's another aspect to this. The loudest voice doesn't have a magic cure for your insecurities. They just have a louder way of overlooking the aspects that need to be considered. Yet we're all susceptible, and we've all been seduced by charisma. It's that magnetic pull of someone who just seems to have it. They have a presence, and honestly, it's one of the hardest things to look beyond. So you've got to learn to recognize when you're following someone because they're right, or when you're following them because you're not willing to ensure to have the complete picture. Consider the people who get elected. More often than not, it's not what they say, as much as the way they say it that inspires us. We're wired to find high-energy individuals intriguing. We see that spark and we instinctively think, they must know something I don't. Or we feel validated because they're saying what we're feeling. But we often mistake that outward presence for inward capability. And for many of them, that charisma is a performance, not a pedigree. It's a tool for engagement, not a guarantee of execution. And you have to be willing to acknowledge that their only skill might be that they've mastered the art of the show. Now, I want you to also think about the people who have actually helped you grow. They're more than likely the ones who've spent the hours doing the boring, repetitive, unglamorous work, which is what builds real skill. So when you let yourself be swayed by a big personality, you're often choosing how they make you feel over what's actually fact. You're letting the delivery distract you from their deficiency. True self-leadership is about being unimpressed by the fireworks and more interested in the qualification. But the hardest part is realizing that the person who can fire you up isn't always the person who can get you across the finish line. The loudest people don't just use volume. They use confusion, almost like a weapon. Pay attention to them, and you'll see that they likely talk in circles. They say what matches the moment, and it's one of the most effective ways they hide their lack of knowledge. They're betting that most people are only listening to the tagline, not the substance. And if you truly listen to what they're saying, it'll generally only state the problem and lack a viable solution. When someone hides behind a wall of critiques and finger pointing, it might actually be that they're afraid of being discovered themselves, that they aren't as accomplished as they want you to believe. They use words as a shield to keep you from seeing that there's no engine under their hood. And we let them get away with it instead of asking simple questions that would expose their lack of competence. Here's a test you can apply when evaluating what someone is saying. If they can't explain it simply, then they don't understand it well enough. True mastery is the ability to take the complex and make it understandable. Remember, It's our responsibility to ask the questions, even if we just ask them of ourselves. Don't let yourself be out-talked by someone who hasn't outworked you. Stop being caught up in the web of their words and start looking for the content and context, because they might not be trying to inform you as much as they're hoping you keep watching the show. We like to think that we're immune to the noise, but we all know those voices that seem to suck up all the oxygen. Yeah, they're charismatic, they're controversial, and they're bold in their stance and their opinions. When someone articulates the frustration you've been feeling, there's a certain comfort in that. You feel aligned. There's a sense that finally someone is saying what needs to be said. But there's a difference between being a leader and a performer. And the loudest voice can often just be the most committed to the spotlight, not the one most committed to the facts. It's easy to mistake volume for competence, charisma for expertise, because performers thrive on the reactions, the likes, the shares, the comments. They say what we want to hear because it's the shortest path to our engagement. They lean into the bias and ignore the complexity of reality because the whole picture rarely helps their soundbite. However, the voices that actually move the needle are frequently the ones examining the corners of the situation that everybody else is ignoring, because they aren't there to validate your current perspective. They're there to challenge it. So if we only listen to the voices that mirror our own thoughts, we aren't learning. We're just the audience in their play, and they're the ones making money off of us. As always, thanks for spending a few minutes with me. Until next time, stay sharp, stay grounded, and keep showing up.